Okay, so we start with the panel discussion on empowering the poor. On the panel, we have Barun Mitra, Dr. Parth Shah, Shruti Rajagopalan, and Yatish, who's here to moderate the session. Yatish is the CEO of Center for Civil Society and a guide and advisor at the think tank Future Institute and a fellow at the Institute of Competitiveness India, set by the Harvard Business School. Audience, please note that you can ask your questions in the Q&A box. In the last 15 minutes of the session, we will be taking up your questions with the panelists. Opening the stage for the panel, Empowering the Poor. Over to you, Yatish.
Thank you, Asta. So welcome everybody to the panel on empowering the poor. We have, as you know, a great panel here, 3 speakers, all 3 of them well known to this community. And we are going to discuss basically not just empowering the poor, but how to empower the poor. You know, the discussion, at least in government circles for the last so many years, has always been about elevating poverty or removing poverty. It's only, I mean, lately that we have started seeing more work being done by the government on empowering the poor. There are various measures of, and there are various ways of measuring who's poor and who's not poor. Some of those measures are based on poverty lines. Some of them are based on, experience deprivation of services, which could be either food, energy, housing, drinking, water, sanitation, healthcare, or education. But empowering, basically, when we say empowering the poor, we mean giving the individual, the right and the means to decide, define, and determine their own destiny. Today's discussion, we have 3 speakers: Barun Mitra, Parth Shah, and Shruti Rajagopalan. The format of today's discussion is very simple. Each of the speakers is going to speak for 10 minutes each. The Q&A will be opened while they're speaking, but the questions will be addressed only after all the speakers have spoken. So I will encourage all of you to put in your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat box. The Q&A questions will come to me, and I will then ask the panelists these questions. If you want the questions to be answered by a particular panelist, do say that. That said, I will ask the panelist, Barun, first. Barun, the floor is all yours. Please go ahead.
Hello. Thanks, Yatish. It's a challenge, but let me try. Why we are poor, I think, is a more fundamental question. Like, why are some people poor? And my simple answer is that poverty is man-made largely, because poor people tend to be quite hardworking. I mean, for the simple reason they have no other option. But most of them find it very difficult to climb out of the poverty circle that they are in. And the lockdown, the COVID-19 lockdown, has provided a very good real life example of like it has unlocked the mysteries of poverty. Because what it has shown is that what happens when you suddenly switch off the engines or the levers that runs the economy. And I think this is, it's really rare, or in fact, one can't even imagine when, if at all, such a situation may have happened in the past. But the impact is all real, in the sense that even today's paper talks of the fact that a survey found that 80% of the families, Indian families, have experienced a decline in their income. And we are, of course, daily witnessing thousands, if not lakhs, hundreds of thousands of people who are laborers and workers, some even with their families walking back to their home because their sources of income have dried up. So what it actually shows, and I am the one sector that I'm particularly interested in, is the one that has in a way borne the brunt of the lockdown, as well as have fared relatively better than some other parts of the country. And I'm interested in agriculture because the lockdown and its and the impact on transportation, the impact of physical distancing on the functioning of the markets, the closure of various kinds of offices, restaurants, eateries, etc., which has impacted demand for agriculture. What's really interesting, and I found it really interesting, is because I had not thought it would happen at the beginning of the lockdown, is that major wholesale markets in urban centers like in Delhi or Bombay have witnessed a decline of 50% in supply. Yet the prices at the consumer end have not really spiraled, which one would have expected in a normal situation, which means that the demand has really fallen. And not just the demand from some sectors which are closed, but also demand from the consumers as such because of the fear and the uncertainty that that COVID-19 and the lockdown has kind of created. This actually, this last 6 weeks, to me actually is a tragic but a very graphic illustration of why people are poor or why poverty persists in our society as well as in many others. As I see it, poverty is not lack of cash, but the inability to capitalize whatever little assets one may have. And people who are poor tend to suffer from this inability to capitalize, be it any factors of production that we can think of, labor, land, and capital. The poor typically are either regulated, restricted, or prohibited from capitalizing those assets in various forms. And it is reflected in, and the lockdown has shown that it has reflected in the restricted access to trade, limited reach to the reach of the market, the restrictions on technology, the problem with capital accumulation, etc. So all these features of poverty seems quite predictable in the sense that the lockdown has shown it is so, but throughout history and the theories generally had kind of predicted that these would be the situations in which poverty would persist. And the case for agriculture is really startling because no one can deny that India has moved from being a basket case in the 50s and 60s to a bread basket today. There's no shortage of food in India, that's for sure. Even in the 70s, hardly anyone or many experts did actually predict that India and countries like Bangladesh, etc., would have to be simply written off because the world would not be able to feed themselves. India actually is a net food exporter over the last 30 years. The agriculture is India's largest private sector by far, yet it contributes only 15% of the GDP, but has to support almost 50% of the workforce. No sector of the Indian economy is as regulated, restricted, or almost prohibited from taking certain actions as agriculture is. You know, we talk of liberalization of the Indian economy that started in the 1930s. 1990s. But agriculture has not witnessed any of that liberalization in the last 30 years. And the result is that the terms of trade has been perpetually skewed against agriculture to favor the consumers, except for some years in the middle decades of middle years of 2010s, or say between 2009-10 to 12-13. Except for those 4, 5, 6 years, the terms of trade has always been skewed against agriculture, and it's not an accident. It's not an accident because despite us producing more than adequate food grain to feed ourselves, we have a situation where 40% of farmers want to quit agriculture. 66%, or 2/3 of the farmers, do not want their children to take up agriculture as their profession. And what to me is really interesting bit that I kind of realized over the last decade is the mindset that has strangled agriculture is not really restricted to agriculture alone. You know, and you can make out from the last 5, 7, 6 years that India has jumped 50 ranks in the World Bank's ease of doing business report in the last few years. But this period has also coincided with the longest period of declining growth rates in the last 3 decades. I mean, it's amazing that India has made an historic jump in performance in terms of the index of the doing business report is concerned, yet doing business in India has never been so difficult as today. So why this issue is important is because the problem of agriculture is not limited to agriculture. It is not caused by the farmers themselves as such, because the policies that are pursued with the hope of helping agriculture, protecting the farmers, have actually achieved the exact opposite in terms of their impact. For instance, one consistent policy tool that has been there for almost 6 decades now is the minimum support price that the government announces for many crops. It's another story that the government ends up procuring 80% of it from only 2 crops, rice and wheat. The rest are quite marginal in that basket. But what's telling is that what it has caused in terms of distortion in the price signal, making the government of India, particularly the Food Corporation of India, the largest hoarder and trader in food grain. We have overproduction, inefficiency, and environmental degradation. The 2 sets of crops that kind of comes to my mind regarding this MSP and the tragedy of the support price is rice and wheat on the one hand, and cotton and sugarcane on the other. I find it really interesting that rice and wheat is what is procured by the government in largest quantity at some of the highest prices in the world. Yet,
Barun,
India has, hello, yeah?
Your 10 minutes are up, so if you can quickly sum up the main point, yeah.
Yeah, so the key point is that MSP has destroyed India's agriculture. It has rice, we are the largest exporter in the world. Wheat, we can't export at all. Cotton, we have emerged in the last 15 years as one of the major exporters, whereas sugarcane, one of India's most successful crops, we have no chance of succeeding in the international market. Now, why has this happened? And this gets me to my final points. That the trading in agriculture is completely restricted or limited, which means, and particularly the COVID and lockdown crisis gives us an opportunity to either suspend or abolish the agricultural produce marketing committee acts that are there at the state level.
Barun, I'll have to stop you there.
Okay. So,
okay. I know this is a new experience for all of us in terms of the, talking to an audience that we can't see. But I want to give every speaker at the same time.
Yeah, maybe in the question answers. Okay.
Yes. So,
thank you.
So now the next speaker is Parth. Parth is no stranger to this community. He is the founder of CCS. He is also the founder of ISPP. Parth, I would like you to take the floor.
Thank you, Yatish, for this opportunity. And I see the Barun looks very different than what I remember him seeing last time. So there is certainly a big impact of the lockdown on ourselves. Let me start by a simple proposition that people have natural tendency to improve their condition. And if you find that people are not able to fulfill that desire, we have to ask ourselves, why is that the case? And as Barun was pointing out, much of that is because of the institutions that we have put in place, the regulatory architecture, the governance architecture that we put in place. Right? So that is where I think root of the problem lies. I think understanding that is the key part of solving the challenge of poverty. At one level, I think it is very well understood across various professions what are the key ingredients that we need to produce wealth. Right? Yes, there's a debate at the margin in terms of what should be done, but the fundamentals of what produces wealth in a market economy are not really in dispute. Now, whether you are a capitalist or a communist, right? Certain basic factors are quite commonly accepted. Now, we may disagree about how far we should go on it. So, if you look at our 1991 reforms, right, one of the sort of where our economic history, in a sense, modern history begins, right? You see that we had a freedom until that point, but we did not have dignity, as Gucharan Das sort of reminds us. The dignity of an individual came with the 1991 reforms. Right? In the reforms, some groups benefited, and some have not as much. Right? And what's the difference? Why is the difference? And I think many have argued that the difference between India and Bharat. So India has done well after 91 reform, and Bharat has not done so well. I would want to argue if you focus on the institutions and the governance architecture, you will realize that it's not so much the India versus Bharat, but it's more about the areas that have been liberalized and the areas which have not been liberalized. Right? And so the degree of economic freedom or livelihood freedom that you see in the sector that decides how well the people in the sector are going to be doing. Right? And if you look at the sector that have done well, airline, banking, to telecom, and the rest of them, are the sectors which have seen the most reforms. The sectors which have not seen much reform, one of the ones the Barun talked about is agriculture, right? And there are many other areas which have not, and those areas are not doing so well for themselves. Right? So it is a challenge of the institutions, and we have to figure out how to change those institutions. So I would say three groups of people have not done so well. One is, of course, farmers. Right? Second is urban informal sector. It's a huge sector. Now we are much more aware of the migrants within that sector because their focus has been on them in the lockdown period. Right? But there's a large sector of urban informal economy. Right? That's where nothing much has changed. And the third group which have not done so well is I would call tribals or forest dependent communities, right? Which are dependent largely on resources that forest generates and where they are living and earning their livelihood. And each of these sectors, there are specific things that need to be done. And I'm sure There are many ideas in terms of what needs to be done. I would just point out that in case of urban informal sector, right, we need to find a way to formalize it, starting with street vendors and the micro enterprises. We do have a Street Vendor Act in India, but it's not really enforced or put in place. There are many reasons for it, but one key reason is the lack of coordination that exists in the urban space management. Right? The issue of vendors is about urban space management, and that urban space is owned, managed by multiple different local agencies, including also state agencies. And that's no coordination that exists among them. So unless we find a way to solve that problem, I think the vendors' challenge would remain with us, and so would the micro enterprises that are run by them. For the, I think, tribals, we have a Forest Rights Act. I think challenge is to how to implement that truthfully and comprehensively. Right? If we are able to do so, it would generate a lot of revenues for the tribals as well as for the Gram Panchayats. Right? And that area, which one of the areas that CCS worked on was on bamboo. Bamboo was defined as a tree in the Indian Forest Act. Just last year ago, it got really classified as a grass. And now it is open to local people as well as Gram Panchayat to extract bamboo, to auction bamboo. And some of the Gram Panchayats which have used this actually have earned substantial sums of money. Right? If you can imagine, that's a renewable resource. Every 2 or 3 years, you can auction that resource and raise that kind of money at a local level, at the Gram Panchayat level. And that could be a tremendous boon to the people living in those areas. Right? So FRA Act exists. It needs to be implemented fully, both in terms of the community resources as well as the individual resources, the claim on the land that is given to individuals under the Act. Right? I think last point I will make before, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions will come up and it's good to discuss them, is about the what Barun said about agriculture. Right? One of the key way of solving that problem is actually allowing farmers to exit agriculture. Right? So I think Arvind Panagaria says this quite well. The best way to help the farmers is not to be one. Right? And now see that if you want to exit agriculture and do something else, right? What barriers are there in your path? Right? First, for example, what you can do is convert your land into something else, maybe commercial land, maybe residential land. But that conversion of land is almost impossible to do on your own. Right? It requires huge sums of money, much strong network of connections to be able to do that. Right? Second thing you can do with the land, which is probably the only resource asset that you have, right, is to sell the land. But who will buy the land? Law requires only farmers can buy it. Well, the farmers are not doing so well. Which farmer is going to be able to buy that land? Right? Again, the exit from the agriculture is prevented. Right? Third thing you can do is to lease land to some other party that you can trust. The laws, including land records and ownership laws, are such that people don't really have faith and confidence in leasing their assets on a long-term basis. So I think one way to help farmers is to make it easier for them to exit and for the families to do something else. Right? So as Barun pointed out, agriculture now is about 17% of the GDP, right? But about 50% or so, even more, of the population depends on agriculture. Right? So simple numbers tells you that if out of 100 units, 17 are produced by agriculture, but out of 100 people, 50 are dependent on agriculture. There is just no way that those 50 people are going to be able to do well for themselves. Right? We need to find a way to allow those people to exit agriculture and find something else to do. And I'm thinking that about agriculture is very important in terms of how we can help farmers to do better in the country. So farmers, tribals, urban informal sector, 3 of them have not done so well, largely because the degree of economic freedom or livelihood freedom that they enjoy is quite limited.
Thank you, Thank you very much, Parth. That was a very succinct and good exposition of the three areas. And these three components, as you uh, talked about, which is farmers, urban poor, and tribals, almost constitute 86% of the informal employment in the informal sector. So while there is a huge push for the formal sector, there is very little on the informal sector. Our third speaker of the day is Shruti. Shruti is a senior fellow at Marketer Center. She's a frequent commentator, a frequent, writer on both Indian and international platform. Shruti, welcome to this session. Good to see you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Yatish. And it's really great to see you and Parth and Barun. It's good to know that everyone is well. And I must say, Barun, you look a little bit like Dadabhai Nauroji, given the lockdown and its consequences. And you also sound like him, which is a compliment. So today I want to talk a little bit about empowering the poor in a slightly different direction than what Barun and Parth have already talked about. I'll caveat by saying I agree 100% with them. So there is no question that as India and Indians started integrating more and more with the countrywide market and the global market, India and Indians got richer. And so the areas in the economy that were liberalized first or were not regulated too much in the first place, like IT, were the biggest beneficiaries, and the areas which were the most regulated, which in my mind are capital markets, have remained the most poor, and the people who work in those areas have been trapped. And I think we are seeing both those crises play out. One is, of course, agriculture, which Barun talked about in great detail. The other is the current migrant labor crisis that we're having. And if you observe, most of these workers are working in the informal urban sector that Parth talked about, and they receive no protection from any of the regulation. In fact, they're harmed by a lot of the regulation, which is why they're in the unorganized or informal sector in the first place, with no contracts or other potential safety nets to protect them. Now, I want to talk a little bit about unconditional cash transfers, or what has been called income support. Now, in developed countries, this is more commonly known as universal basic income because they promise it to everybody. In developing countries, it is, tends to be quasi-universal, or rather not universal. It, protects some section of the poor with a threshold that cuts off on who receives that protection. But the important thing about the income support is that it is unconditional and it is not means tested. That is, you don't have to prove that you're a farmer who has been tilling a certain piece of land to get a particular kind of fertilizer subsidy, right? You just get the money if you are who you say you are, and we can target at that individual level. And the support is unconditional. Now, the reason I would like to talk about this kind of income support, or, unconditional cash transfers to the poor, is I think they are relevant on three different margins in present day India and the world. So the first is the COVID response. So what we have observed with COVID, it's an incredible natural experiment that has completely stopped the working of the market economy because of the stringent lockdown. Now, as Barun and Parth pointed out, it has become very clear post the lockdown what the engines of growth in the Indian economy really are. So people, the moment they are not integrated in the market anymore, are immediately vulnerable. Now, there's, of course, differences in the level of vulnerability. So, the most privileged people who own businesses, they see a contraction in aggregate demand, they see a breakdown in supply chains. The poorest people, of course, are most vulnerable because they tend to be daily wage labor, or in the case of agriculture, unless they manage to sell their produce, they're not going to be able to feed their family. Now, there are historical reasons for why our regulation has pushed people into this situation of working as daily wage laborers. It is not anybody's choice, neither the employer nor the workers. But because of compliance costs, people are pushed into this situation, but they are the most vulnerable. So the moment the market economy stops, or the moment they are not able to engage in market activities because they get sick, or a family member gets sick, or there's an accident at the workplace and they fracture their hand or something like that, these are the reasons why they immediately become vulnerable to poverty when normally they're not. So normally the analogy we use when we think about poverty is a poverty trap, which makes you think it's a sort of mouse trap or like a ditch in which people fall and then you lift them out of that trap. I think it's a little bit different. I think the analogy should be a little bit closer to a treadmill, right? The more you run on the treadmill, the better you get at it, which is how the market process works. But when the treadmill stops or when it breaks down, then suddenly there's nothing. And we have about 200 million people at the moment, by most recent estimates, who were recently lifted out of poverty, who are sort of at that brink of when the treadmill stops running, they stop running because they don't have large amounts of savings to fall back on, or any kind of, government or private safety net, because they're not part of the employee provident fund and all those other sorts of protections that employers and employees can engage in to protect an individual worker. So this is the situation we're in. So I think as a COVID response, an income support is incredibly important. Now, why do I say income support instead of the many other in-kind and other transfers that the government wants to give? Two reasons. One, most of the subsidies that the government wants to give, and we can discuss this more in Q&A, tend to distort markets. So on the margin, they tend to be not so clean, right? They distort the incentives of the people involved. A cash transfer tends to be much cleaner. Second, there is better targeting when there is an unconditional cash transfer. And that is something we really need to think about. Third, we don't know what each of these people's needs are. We don't know who needs fertilizers. We don't know who needs LPG gas, and we don't know who needs medicines, right? So the easiest thing to do is to give cash in this moment when people are dealing with this tremendous difficulty. So as a COVID response, I think a cash transfer is a tremendously good idea. But I want to extend that a little bit, because I think past the COVID response also, an unconditional cash transfer is a good idea. And I say this for three more reasons. First, I agree with everything that Barun and Parth have said about markets and the importance of markets and deregulating markets. Having said that, we know that markets are not perfect, smooth machines, right? There are businesses that come and go. It is possible to fall sick. It is possible to have industrial accidents. It is possible to have a bad crop. Now, in developed economies, the way we deal with all these problems is the market typically comes up with a solution. So for the question of smoothing out the farm cycle, we have excellent cold storage and warehousing and, futures options and things like that farmers across the world rely on, so that they can actually spread their risk. And it is not a moment when it's a do or die situation when their produce is on the market and they're not able to sell it. But while India develops that, as India develops that, there is still a very high degree of vulnerability as India integrates into markets. And this vulnerability is not uniform. It is not for everybody, but it does exist. It is very similar for people exiting agriculture and entering a new industry. It is not seamless. It's not like you were a farmer yesterday and you can be a doctor tomorrow, or you can be a wage laborer tomorrow in some kind of specialized factory function. So what tends to happen is they fall in the unskilled labor pool, and that pool becomes very vulnerable. Income support can go a long way in helping people train themselves, retool themselves, move from rural to urban areas without facing that kind of stress. The third reason is, I believe unconditional cash transfers are much better when it comes to caste discrimination, because they're unconditional, they're not means tested. Currently, if you talk to different caste groups, one understands how large the variation is in terms of receiving benefits that are already promised, especially to Dalit communities. And the last point I want to make is, even in developed economies, we've seen a huge backlash against markets, as we saw with the rise of the nationalist right in America and in Europe, that when the market process is working efficiently and taking those jobs away to other countries, there is a huge backlash against markets. So in a sense, I feel like if we want to preserve the market process, we need to find some way of empowering those who are the most vulnerable, and on the margin, not standalone, but on the margin, an unconditional cash transfer is the cleanest. Now, ideally, I'd want to be in a world where nobody needs this kind of support and government does not engage in the business of redistribution. But we are not yet there as a country, and we are at risk of hundreds of millions of Indians who've just been lifted out of poverty who might fall back in that trap.
Thank you very much, Shruti. That was such a wonderful exposition of how, you've brought the academic and the real world together. And you actually pointed out to a nuance that most people miss, that there is always transition between systems and no system is perfect. And the vulnerable, when systems are changing and people are into transition, the impact on the vulnerable section is that much more. So while you help them transition, but you also empower them through, like you suggested, universal cash transfer to help them transition. Wonderful, thank you very much. Now, we are going to basically start the panel discussion now. So if all of you can switch on your videos, Parth, Barun and Shruti, and your mics, yes. Barun, your video and your mic, if you can, we're starting the panel discussion. You can also switch on your video. Okay, so Parth, okay, Barun's there. So Barun, you had some points which I think you could not sum up in your speech. One of the things that Shruti raised and one of the things that Parth also raised, and I wanted you to weigh in on this, which is on agriculture, and specifically in agriculture, the role of the migrant labor, and how will the identification, or if you agree with Shruti's idea that there should be a universal cash transfer, there is, a large migrant population which is agricultural labor. Do you think it is possible to implement what Shruti is proposing for that section of the society?
I have an issue with this question of cash transfers as a way out.
Yes.
Because while the hardships are real, what we need to, and in my view, I mean, we can have a separate discussion, debate on the UBI and how universal or how limited, restricted it should be, etc. But I have a fundamental problem in the government giving out money in this form because it's not theirs to give. What is necessary, particularly in the current context, and which should be recognized, is that those displaced, whether they're informal workers, whether they're formal sectors laid out, whether they're agriculture labor, whoever, are victims of policies pursued by the government. And therefore, just like in land acquisition, these people deserve, and the state has an obligation to compensate them for the harm that the state action has caused. If land acquisition requires compensation, if nationalization of industry requires compensation, this is wholesale nationalization or restriction on economic options. And
okay.
Therefore it requires compensation of a kind that we have not seen at all yet. But the first question is to recognize the harm that it has caused so that a compensation is called for and not a charity and a handout.
Yeah. So, we have been flooded with questions. I have not seen so many questions coming in.
May I respond for a second to Barun?
Yeah, Shruti, please go ahead.
Yeah, so, I agree on principle with Barun. I do agree that this is not the state's resources to take, and therefore not the state's resources to redistribute. Having said that, we already do it. about 10 to 11% of the GDP is currently redistributed. And it is redistributed through centrally sponsored schemes. You know, these are your Swachh Bharat Abhiyan and Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan and all of these abhiyans, and central government subsidies, right? And these subsidies are massive. So if you look at the Economic Survey of India, this was the one written by Arvind Subramaniam, this was the 2017 version. They list just the top few subsidies, and that amounts to about 5% of the GDP, which according to the Economic Survey can be given out to 75% of the poor. So while on principle, so I want to make this point clear to everyone listening, because while on principle, I agree that the state should not be in the business of redistribution, there is a question of, if the state is in the business of redistribution, what can we do on the margin that it actually empowers the poor? And I think income support answers the latter question, right? It can never satisfy the former question. But to satisfy the former question, we need a fundamental redefining of the relationship between the citizen and the state in India. And that, I think, is a slightly different matter. That's not just a policy matter. That's a more fundamental question.
Yeah. So we have another fundamental question from one of the from the audience. Luis Miranda is asking all three of you that why has it been so difficult for politicians and bureaucrats to see the light of what you have been saying, not just now, but for many years? Parth, you would like to go on that first?
Maybe I think I can think of two reasons. One, of course, is a public choice reason. We had a session on public choice earlier in the day, and those who attended the session would understand that clearly about the self-interest of the politicians and bureaucrats. And even though we like to believe that they are aligned with the larger social interest or the public interest, quite often, more often than not, they are not, right? And that, I think, contradiction plays out in different ways in the system, one of which is what Luis Miranda has alluded to in his question. I think second, maybe more systemic, equally systemic issue is the level of government at which the reform or change is required. Right? So if you can see the 1991 reforms, which have been done quite systematically, the reform was required in terms of international trade, right? Some of the rules around RBI, the macro management of the economy, it was all done by the center. And I think there was large consensus on what needs to be done. And I think we were able to move forward quite quickly in that area. Right? Now, the reform which are required, what most people call it economic reforms 2.0, right, are going to be at the state level. And I think more importantly, like for example, for the vendors, the micro enterprises, for the tribals in the forest areas, it's not even state level, it's even local level, right? Each urban center is different. A state cannot have one single rule that applies to all urban centers in the state. So you'd have to do design, sort of right framework and policies at the local level to help the informal sector. And so I think challenge is in terms of the level at which the policies need to be made. And I think we have not, in a sense, built the capacity at the local level to deal with some of these key challenges. I think also the COVID response has clearly pointed out that we may be able to we may be good in doing centralized lockdown, right? Because it's a one single rule that we apply to the whole country. But now getting out of lockdown cannot be done by central rule or by central dicta, right? Yeah. That requires local level response, local level authority and a way to manage how to remove lockdown in a step-by-step manner, or in some cases completely in one go.
Shruti, this is a kind of a follow-up question, but specifically to you, I'm just rephrasing Luis Miranda question, which Ramachandran Palasana has also asked. How will we ensure that the cash transactions are not misused by farmers themselves or the government officials or politicians? You know,
I think every individual knows what's best for them, and they know how to use it best. Abuse and misuse of public funds is a different question than abuse and misuse of private funds. I believe there is no such thing. If I wish to spend money on jewelry or alcohol instead of actually feeding my family, that's entirely my business, not the business of the state, not the business of society.
So I think
Right?
the word that should be used is cash, not transaction, but cash transfer. How will the
Yes.
cash transfer not be misused by
Okay.
farmer
So,
themselves or the government
no,
officials
well,
and so on?
farmers themselves, there is no question. I think once you give an unconditional cash transfer, that's the end of the matter. You need to trust that people know what to do for themselves. When it comes to misuse by government officials, I think so far the evidence across other developing countries, especially countries in Latin America, show that cash transfers tend to have fewer leakages than other kinds of targeted conditional subsidies. So there is that matter. Now, in India, we have reasonably good identification of the poor, right? We don't have good targeting of the poor, especially the rural poor, you know, the below poverty line identification. We have over the years got, you know, slightly better at identifying the poor. Now, we haven't gotten very good at targeting them because most of these are these conditional subsidies which require forms in triplicate, and you need to prove that you're a farmer, and then you need to prove that you're actually using this. So I think a way to escape all of that, this is not a silver bullet. It is just on the margin a little bit more efficient. But the broader question that Lewis asked is, I think a very large part of it is economic illiteracy and a fundamental misunderstanding of how markets work, right? And this is under threat by two forces. One is paternalism, which is the kind of, you know, farmers don't know what to do. We need to protect them from themselves. They will sell their land to rich industrialists like East India Company, and, you know, they won't know what to do with the money. They will drink the money and then, you know, sell their kids into trafficking. So we hear all sorts of nonsense arguments. There is only one word for them. They are paternalist and patronizing and frankly very elitist. The other is a tendency towards centralization and government control because there is a misunderstanding of the market process, right? A misunderstanding that the market process can actually be replaced or efficiently intervened in because all the focus is on people's intentions and not on how incentives actually operate in a decentralized economy. And I think even now, when you talk to policymakers, they fundamentally don't understand the buoyancy factor that Parth talked about. By buoyancy, I mean the tendency of each individual to want to improve themselves the way they see best, right?
Yeah,
This is just
yeah.
something that is missing in the Indian mindset because of paternalism and centralization.
Now, this is a question put for you, Parth, and maybe Barun also. Parth, you said that we should make it easier for farmers to exit from agriculture, and they could find some other options. So the question is where they should go. I mean, like if a farmer who has no skills, you know, he will basically become, if he sells his land, he would either become a migrant laborer, or he would become part of the so-called informal labor force in the urban milieu. So is there a kind of plan which has to be done or made before we start thinking about exit from agriculture?
I think the reason why we think the option of becoming laborer or worker somewhere else, maybe in a factory or in an office, right, or doing something of your own as an entrepreneur, right, we don't see as a good option largely because of the, as I talked about in my opening remarks, the kind of regulatory structure we have created in those sectors, right? So reason why it is informal is not because somehow it's inherent to that kind of work, right? It is largely because of the laws we have put in place, right? So I think what we need to do, as I mentioned also, that we need to reform those areas. We do have in some cases proper laws which need to be implemented in a sort of right way, right? So I think my sense is that farmers, and you can ask historically also what has happened. We had about 80%, 90% people living on farming. Of course, today we have only half of that, right? So where did all the people go, right? Not all of them are dirt poor and living on the margin of the roadsides of the urban areas, right? Yeah. So I think just as Shruti pointed out, understanding of the market process, understanding of how wealth is created, right? I think that is an important idea in the whole economic literacy, which is missing generally, right? So it's not the same size of pie that just gets divided across people,
Yes.
right? It is pie that grows, and it grows because people are doing different things, right? It grows because I find that my human capital, my resources, my assets are better used in something else than what I'm doing today with them, right? And that discovery process is what allows us, each one of us, whether you're a farmer or a not farmer, right, to do something better for ourselves. And in the process, we do also something better for the society as a whole.
Barun, this question is for you. Uh, can you please elaborate how MSP acts as a hindrance to growth?
MSP is a hindrance to growth.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's not a hindrance to growth if we are looking at growth in terms of production. India today is surplus. In fact, we don't have any place to sell. So it's not the hindrance to production as such. I mean, it has actually induced production that we don't need or no one needs in the world. But it is hindrance to agriculture development and the state of the farmer. You know, this is the paradox that Indian agriculture has been hugely successful. It is successful beyond the imagination of anybody 20, 30, 40 years ago. Yet, Indian agriculture and the farmers particularly have been in crisis for the last few decades, if not longer. So it is this paradox that we need to understand, and this paradox is primarily because we have distorted the market. And MSP has been the single biggest factor that has distorted the market, and rice and wheat is a very good example of this, and cotton and sugar, like I mentioned last time. Rice is procured by the government, wheat is procured by the government, we produce more than enough. But rice of only certain types are procured by the government. There are various varieties of rice which is not procured by the government, but which is traded and exported. And therefore, in the last 10 years, we have emerged as the largest exporter of rice. It has nothing to do with MSP. It had to do with opening the market and having a relatively stable export and trade environment.
Shruti, you wanted to add to that? Is that where you?
No, I think Barun's absolutely right.
So there's another question from Ranjit Bhushan. He is asking you that has agriculture been left out of economic reforms because unlike telecom, it is too unwieldy and also too politically crucial for the both politicians and bureaucrats?
That's a very interesting question, and I've been thinking a lot on that why did agriculture get left behind? And so obviously that everybody recognizes it, including the government. And I think it links to something that Louis Miranda asked earlier. I think when we discuss public policy, there are two words in that phrase, public and the policy. We normally discuss the policy aspect and analyze it threadbare. We very rarely look at the public aspect, except for looking at the public in the sense that they are a recipient of these policies, which is where the political issue is. That all our advocacy in terms of policy reforms have failed to generate the kind of political support or the public support, and therefore the political capital that will make it necessary to happen. And because that has not happened, the vested interests and the existing entrenched interests have kept the situation where it is, and virtually every consumer in this country is partly responsible for it. Because the state of agriculture is not because of some, malaise in terms of the leadership or the policymakers. It's because all of us have benefited from lowered agricultural prices, and the farmers have paid the price with their lives. So therefore, I think we need to figure out, we need to really rethink this whole issue of public policy as an advocacy issue. Whom are we advocating for? Who should advocate for it, buy it, and take it on their own? That's the public. We need to build that constituency if we really want reform, whether in agriculture or any other sectors, because Parth had a list of many other sectors which had not really seen much reforms.
So we just have 5-6 minutes left. There's one interesting question which has come up. the new Land Acquisition Act, given that the attempts to reform land acquisition has been unsuccessful, how do you think the government should now approach land acquisition per se?
Um,
Allow
I,
land markets.
yes. So if I may answer that,
Yes, Shruti,
the
please go ahead.
attitude of the government is again this is very centralized thinking, right? So the idea is that if we need a large industrial or a tech park to come in, then there is this problem of land assembly. Right now, let's understand why is there a problem of land assembly in India in the first place. It's very bizarre. Indian farmers are dying to sell their land, developers are dying to buy their land, and magically a community that is always haggling and transacting is suddenly unable to do so. Right? So there's some fundamental friction going on in the market, but it's not really a market, right? There is no functional land market in India. Now, the reason for this is because of a whole bunch of regulation from the 50s and 60s, we kept reducing the size of land holdings. Right? This was a backlash against zamindari. So the idea was you want to break up the large estates. Now that tends to happen automatically over generations. Estates do get smaller, but because we had a maximum land ceiling act, right? Maximum land anyone can hold, urban and rural, over 3 generations, suddenly you had pocket-sized land holdings. In fact, things got so bad that the government had to pass in many states a minimum land holding legislation to say you can't, break down a holding size smaller than this. Now, this is the reason we're not able to naturally have large pockets of land. Now, there's a secondary reason, and Parth briefly touched upon this. This is partly exit of agriculture, but also why does the government have to approve change of land use? Why does the government only approve change of land use at the end of the buyer and not at the end of the seller? So in India, what you have is, if it's agricultural land, the market value of that land, because it can only be sold to a farmer for agricultural use, is X. If it's land for development, with the change of land use certificate in hand, suddenly the market value of that land is 30 to 40X. Yes. So what we actually have is we have dual or triple markets in land with 3 different prices. So in India, we don't actually have a holdout problem. If you notice, farmers don't protest selling of land, they only protest compensation. And this is where the Land Acquisition Act is just a complete scam and an assault on human dignity and rights. Yeah. They have turned what is legitimately owed as asset value, market asset value of land. The government has depressed it. It has eliminated it. And then under the guise of charity, it will take land under the coercive power of the state and it will give compensation, which is typically insufficient because the compensation is marked around market prices and we have already depressed the market price for land. So this is the land acquisition problem, right? It is entirely manufactured by the state. And now they have this really coercive law to apparently solve the problem that they created in the first place.
There's an insight there. Most land usage files actually are signed only by the chief minister of the state.
Yes.
So that gives you the idea of centralization and control that they want to exercise.
And then it is sold as ease of doing business under single window clearance.
Yes, yes, with a signal signature actually. Barun, you wanted to say something about land pooling, and I think we have 1 minute for you to kind of say that, please, can, on this issue.
Land pooling, all this issue of land, one is on the supply side and on the demand side. Unless people really have options, and our economy, despite all the talk of liberalization, has not really created those options, neither in the form of developing skills nor in the form of finding economic opportunities elsewhere. And therefore, the land is highly contested. Land pooling can work only in situations where the leadership that is undertaking it has a degree of credibility and therefore is able to secure a certain semblance of buy-in among a larger section of the population. Otherwise, land pooling by and large is not going to work.
Okay, great. I think we have almost run out of time, and we have an interesting session next, chaired by Luis Miranda and Dr. Palmer. Thank you, Parth. Thank you, Shruti. Thank you, Barun. It was very interesting to see all your views kind of coalesce, also coming from different direction at the same time with different solutions. And I'm sorry to the audience for not addressing all your questions, but if you can find a way, if you want to have some of these questions answered, maybe you can attend some of the e-policy course that CCS Academy does, especially on public choice, which will address these questions. Thank you again. Thank you, Parth and Shruti and Barun. We
Thank
end
you
the
for
session
having
here.
us.
Thank you, Barun, Parth, Shruti, and Yatish. The discussion was very fruitful and it has given us answers to many pressing challenges faced by us, and most importantly, has left us with many questions that must be posed time and about to current structure, processes, and institutes. Once again, thank you. It was a pleasure having you. Thank you, audience. You've been amazing. I'm sorry, in interest of the time, we couldn't take up all the questions, but you can post them on the Attendify app and continue the discussion.